So a lot of the emphasis on this retreat has been the idea that it's not just one way. And that applies to everything we're talking about. It applies to the practices. Mainly, we've been talking about the style of meditation you do, but also for those of you who've been here for the metta and the compassion practices, we're talking about a range of ways because, again, what makes it alive and open is not the same for everyone. And that is also true about what is more foundational about what we're really all aiming for, this idea of freedom or liberation, or you could call it coming to an ending of our suffering or awakening, whatever words you like to use. What actualizes that is also not just one way. And so today I want to spend a little time talking about some of the qualities that we've been on this retreat emphasizing: the concentration, mindfulness, insight, and the heart qualities. We're saying that really in the bigger picture, all of those have tremendous benefits in their own right. But from a Dharma perspective, they're in service of something deeper, which is this liberation through non-clinging. What leads to that liberation is not just one thing, or it's not one way. And so I want to say a little bit about samadhi, concentration, some of the ways that it can manifest and that we can cultivate it, because we're talking about it, but we haven't really said what it is. And then I want to spend a little time talking about what do we mean by insight. And turns out it's not one way. Sometimes it's taught as one way, and I'll explain that, but it's a range. It's not one thing. It varies quite a bit on what insight is. And then there's a range of ways that these work together. And this may sound like, boy, this is a lot of variables, but it's actually not complicated. And so my goal is that when we're done today, you'll have a good sense of how, and it won't be complicating in your mind, but it will actually be simplifying and then helping us find our own path. So that's what I have in mind. So I want to begin on the topic of the samadhi, concentration. If you look at the etymology of the word samadhi, it actually it really means undistracted. And there's a range of ways, it turns out, that an undistracted mind can manifest on its own, and we can practice in ways that aim the undistracted mind in a few different ways. So let me explain what I mean. This morning in the meditation instructions, I spoke about how at some point, if we keep practicing, doing whatever we're doing, say we're the simple practice of mindfulness of breathing, our minds become more trained, and we strengthen our ability to have a steadier presence. We're not just scattered all over the place so much. The mind starts to settle. And so it's a less distracted, we'd say, a more undistracted presence. It's not that we will never go off, although you can touch, if you take it far enough, you can get to a place where the mind won't wander at all. But that strengthens. And along with that, I mentioned that there's a range of experiences that come along with that are generally pretty pleasant. And we can feel an expansiveness, a calm. I mentioned some of these. We can feel some pleasantness in the body. Sometimes it feels like energy's moving, or just a general sense of pleasant in the body. Or we don't know where it's located. Maybe it's just a mental experience and it's not so clear where it's located. So a lot of ways this undistractedness can arise. if you just, let's just use the example of mindfulness of breathing. If you stayed with that mindfulness of breathing and you kept bringing your attention back over and over, and your ability, as I just said, to stay with the one thing, the breath, strengthened, it could ultimately get so strong that it would never wander away. And it could come to a place where you're so focused just on the one thing. They actually have a term for it. They call it one-pointedness. And if you took it far enough, you could become so, we use the word absorbed, or so engrossed in just focusing on one thing, that you actually stop noticing other experiences around you. That's a kind of undistractedness, where the one object, the one thing that you're placing your attention on, your ability to stay with it is so strong that you actually don't even notice. Not only that they don't pull you away, you don't even notice other things. And the example I use is sometimes, if you've ever been, say, reading something and you get engrossed in what you're reading, and if someone else says, hey, and they're calling to you, and then you don't hear them and they say again, and then finally you go, oh, I'm sorry, what? And you kind of come out of, it's not a trance, but the absorption of what you're reading. That's an example where you were engrossed in something, and so you don't notice other things. And that's kind of that's an undistracted. And if you took that far enough, what would happen is, it went, like I said, you would stop noticing other experiences. And if you took it far enough, for you, your experience of the changing flow of experience would stop. That's a kind of stopping of the mind, a stopping of experience. And they call that one-pointedness. That kind of, you don't have to remember all these details, but I'm just trying to create the sense of it. They'll call it an exclusive concentration, because your awareness, the undistractedness is exclusively on, just say, the breath. And it excludes awareness of other things. So that's one kind of undistractedness. And you don't have to take it all the way as far as what I'm talking about, but we can start moving in a direction where we become engrossed in maybe the pleasure of the samadhi, or the energies, the bliss in the body, or whatever it is. And we just don't notice other experiences. So that's one flavor, one way this can evolve. There's another way it can evolve, which is actually equally as deep and undistracted, but it's actually qualitatively quite differently. And in this second way, it's also, you could take it far enough where there's a stilling or a stopping or a quiescence in the mind. But rather than becoming so exclusively focused on one thing so that the flow of experiences stop, the mind itself stops, but the flow of experiences can keep coming. But there's a stillness in the mind. Now, I have to say, I'm using the term the mind, and people use this term in a lot of different ways. And I don't know what the mind is, actually. And so I'm aware that I'm being a little, I'm not being very precise, but I'm just trying to get the feeling here. And this second kind of undistractedness, again, it's not narrow on one thing or on a point. It's not literally a point, but this one-pointedness. Rather than calling it one-pointedness, to make a distinction, I call it a unification of mind. And it can be quite broad, open, and inclusive. It's not an exclusive, it's an inclusive undistractedness. It doesn't shut anything out. And to kind of get the feeling of it, if you haven't experienced these, you may be thinking, well, what is that? I don't really get it. But when you experience these, it'll be clear. But so you just don't overthink it. I'm just trying to give you a little introduction here. There's a well-known quote by Ajahn Chah, which is the image of the still forest pool. And I can quote it fairly close. I don't remember it exactly, but he says, make your mind like a still forest pool. He said, all kinds of rare and wonderful animals will come to drink at the pool. In other words, many experiences will come and go, but you will be still. So it's the movement of the mind in relationship to things, but it doesn't have to stop any experiences happening. And then he goes on talking about the clarity and the presence of the Buddha that will come from this. So this is this second kind of open, not narrow, inclusive samadhi. And so you don't have to take it all the way to you're in this utter one-pointedness or you're completely still, but we start moving in these directions. So on its own, everyone, if you didn't speak with anyone and just practiced on your own, you'd move in one of these directions or the other. Almost everyone would move in the direction of the second, where the mind would become more still, but you would actually be not disconnected from your experience. You'd actually, it would enhance connection. So this is an important part. You can practice the first kind of samadhi I was talking about. I'm not going to get into that much here. It'd be offline. I would have a conversation with you if you want. I'm happy to. You're welcome to, if you want to read my first book called The Experience of Samadhi, I actually go into a lot of detail of this full range. You don't need to get the book. I'm happy to send you some information if you want. You can let me know. But for most people, they'll head in this direction. And this is something to pay attention to for yourself. Notice for yourself when your mind, if it's already happening or when it does start to happen, the concentration, the steadiness, the undistractedness grows. Notice for yourself that you will be more aware of what's going on. You're not going to become disconnected. Because of that undistractedness, you're more clear, more present, more aware of whatever's happening. Even if you don't necessarily make a point to go looking, you can make a point to go looking, checking in with your body and your mind. And I'm going to say more about that on the insight side in a few moments. But many people find that you don't have to do anything. If something's going on in your body, and this is what I want you to check for yourself as your concentration grows, something going on in your body, you know it. Whatever's going on in your mind, you know it, right? So what's happening, we have the undistractedness is strengthening. All these pleasant experiences associated with it are growing. Those are part of what happens in there, as we'll see in the instructions in coming days. We use that pleasant to help deepen us and pull us in more into the samadhi. That's more techniques of how we work with it. But with all of that, there's just the presence, the undistractedness, and the heightened clarity and perception. The other day I said that it's like your mind can become, and I like both images, it's like we turn the mind into a Hubble telescope, how it becomes so open and vast and powerful. Or the opposite, it's like an electron microscope, which can feel very narrow and deep in that way. And it can feel like, either these on their own, or we can choose to turn the mind in different directions if we wish, if we want to go, investigate things in certain ways. This is the power that comes to our minds. And so the main thing about this undistractedness, this concentration, is that it can enhance connection. And the way I'm teaching is encouraging this style of practice rather than moving to something that's disconnecting us. So I'm going to come back to that. I want to move in now and say a few things on the insight side of the practice and the different ways it's understood. And then we'll come back over. I want to bring a piece of the concentration into the discussion. So let me just recap that. I hope it's simple. The mind just becomes less distracted. That undistractedness can be just undistracted on a thing. We call it one-pointedness, one thing. And it can also be just a steadiness and a clarity, but it's an open, inclusive, wide, broad awareness, and it doesn't exclude anything. Okay, so set that aside for now. I'm going to shift gears, but we'll come back. We often talk about the word insight. Now, this is a big, big topic. The word you hear in Pali, with a V, vipassana, and it's generally translated as insight. The actual meaning, if you look at the etymology of the word vipassana, the pasana comes from the word pasati. It's a verb. It means to see. And the vi has a sense of, it's kind of like if you want to pull apart. So it's the idea is if you wanted to say there was a piece of ground that was full of weeds and you wanted to be able to see to the ground, it's like you put your hands into the weeds and pull them apart so you could see through the weeds to the ground. That's the sense of the vi. So sometimes the word vipassana is, it means to see clearly. We translate it as insight. Now there's a range of ways that insight can arise, and I want to talk about those. And then finally, when I bring the concentration piece back, I want to talk about a range of ways in which we can actually practice concentration, practice insight, either on their own or in relationship to each other. And the bottom line for all of this is, let's find the way, as we've been saying all retreat, that works best for each one of us. So that's the idea. Traditionally, well, in whatever way we understand insight, it's meant to be in service of the liberation through non-clinging in our tradition. So the traditional way insight was taught and understood was insight into what are known as the three characteristics of all experience, or sometimes called the three characteristics of existence. You don't have to remember the list, but I'm just going to pause on it for a moment, and you can do a web search, find it, or so don't stir your mind up trying to remember it too much, but I just want you to have heard it. And the idea is all experiences are impermanent. That's one of the characteristics. And you know, we can give a whole talk, we may, on this retreat about impermanence. It's spoken about a lot because, you know, everything, nothing lasts is the basic idea. Things are changing. Impermanence. That's, and if you care about the Pali, you don't have to know any Pali. That's anicca. Second one, dukkha, is generally translated as suffering, and that's okay. Everybody uses the word suffering, but it really means much more than that. It has the, again, you go to the root meaning of the word, and it has the etymology. The root meaning is the axle or the wheel of a cart that's out of round, and you know what happens if you're riding on a cart where the axles or the wheels out of round? It's a bumpy ride. That's kind of the idea. So suffering, well, let me back up. So the idea on the dukkha is that the words I like better are unreliable, is a good one, or unsatisfactory. Unreliable in the sense, as we all know, that, you know, we only have so much control over things and anything can really happen at any time. That's the nature of things. That's a dukkha. Another way we can understand it is unsatisfactory. Not that experience can't be satisfactory in the moment. Of course it can. Having something really pleasant, you know, I've often used the example that I like good quality dark chocolate. I do. And when I'm eating that dark chocolate, it's pretty satisfying in the moment. But because of impermanence, it's not going to last. If I think that chocolate is going to ultimately solve my problems, it's a setup for suffering. If I'm clinging and holding on, that's where the suffering, the dukkha, turns into suffering. Everything's inherently unreliable. It has an inherent unsatisfactoriness. The idea from an insight point of view is, if we can really get that deeply, we stop looking to the experiences to be ultimately satisfying, and then it doesn't turn into the suffering. I'll come back and say more, but that's the idea right there, the insight into dukkha. If we really got it deeply, the idea is our mind would let go, ostensibly, hopefully. So impermanence, anicca, dukkha, suffering or unsatisfactory, unreliable. And then the third, anatta, which is generally translated as no self. It's actually, everybody says no self. It's a big, everybody thinks. Buddhists say you don't have a self. Completely wrong translation. I guess I have to say something about it since I said that. So let me just pause here on it. The word Anata, that's the Pali and Sanskrit. There's the word Atman. So coming out of the ancient Upanishads, the ancient texts, was the teaching that ultimate reality was what they would call Brahman. And it was like maybe in modern traditions, we talk about God. What's the nature of God? The fundamental, foundational, underlying reality of all things, they would call Brahman. And then everybody, the idea in these Hindu yoga traditions was that everybody had their individual soul, which was called the Atman, which is, and that, you don't have to remember any of this, but just to have heard it, it has 3 characteristics. Sat Chit Ananda, which your soul is, Sat is existence itself, Chit, a pure awareness, consciousness itself, Ananda, pure bliss itself. Doesn't sound bad, right? Pure being, pure consciousness, pure bliss. That's the nature of the soul. And it is said in those traditions that when we really get down and see deeply what's true, the Atman and the Brahman are the same. Our soul is identical. God within and things like that. So that's where that comes from. This word Atman in Pali. Sorry, I'm pausing a moment here. In Pali, instead of Atman, it's the Atta. If you put an A in front, it's a negation. In Sanskrit, Anatman. In Pali, Anata. That's the Anata. It's saying no permanent eternal soul. It's not saying you don't have a self. Of course you have a self. To take it a little further, it shouldn't even be saying that whether you have a soul or not, because it doesn't want to be making ontological truth statements about that. It's really in service of seeing that everything you can know about yourself, that you can connect with, let's just put it that way, that's knowable, it's all impermanent. So it's not that you don't have a self, it's what is the nature of yourself. This is where the insight comes in. And we want to perceive deeply the nature of the self is changing. Your mind's always changing, your body's always changing, your consciousness. And so we could have a whole talk. I don't want to stay on this too long, just so we get through everything. But it's a big, big topic. And each of these, the anicca, impermanence, the dukkha, the suffering, and the anatta, we'll just say no self, because that's what everyone says. Traditionally, you would have insights into one or maybe more of those. And the idea is, as we steady our minds and gain a certain amount of undistractedness and concentration, that they would consider that being on the concentration side, then you would specifically turn your attention, and this is the way of Vipassana insight meditation is often taught, to purposely look for, say, for example, the change of what's going on in your experience, connect with the experience of change. Or when you're suffering, really connecting with the suffering so you come to know it and you learn how to let go around it. So it, like I said, it doesn't become suffering because we're not clinging to it. So it's a big topic on all the different techniques, but this is the basic idea, how we can practice in ways that look to have insights into those 3 characteristics. And so that's a kind of meditation called insight meditation. Well, that's one way insights are understood. And you can practice and have those insights, and many people do. But I want to offer that insights, a much broader view of insights. For me, insights are anything that we understand, that we perceive, that we come to know, that helps liberate our hearts and minds. That's an insight. So for example, you could have psychological insights. Now we all know that psychological awakenings, insights, maybe through psychotherapy or whatever, can be very powerful, can be healing, can help liberate us in many ways. But psychological insights are not necessarily going to further us in the direction of Dharma, but they certainly can. So that would be an example that is not a traditional understanding, but that we definitely want to include in there. You know, one thing this is kind of falls in that category of the psychological. You know, sometimes people will say, for example, okay, I'm doing some healing, you know, and I'm trying to go from places where I'm wounded or I have psychological issues and create a healthy sense of self. But wait a minute, I thought Buddhism said there is no self. So what's this about a healthy sense of self? Well, if we just change the language, I think it works just fine. What is it? I have plenty of relationships I've already mentioned here a few times, especially in my youth. I used to deal quite a bit with some self-esteem issues. A lot of that got just healed up through some therapy, but also through, I think the meditation was quite powerful in healing. A lot of that's just gone. But I know what it's like to, and when we're suffering in any ways, using that as an example, the critical mind, there's just so many, you know, I used that term, the top 10 tunes the other day. We have, you know, many ways our mind creates suffering. If you want to use the phrase unhealthy sense of self, that's fine. We know what is meant. When we are at the effect of those forces, we tend to be very identified, but in a way that's a suffering generating way of identified. Like if it's bad self-esteem, you know, we've got this whole view about I'm this and I'm that, or you know, maybe I'm not worthy of love, or, you know, I'm too aversive, or I'm not enough this, or I'm too much that, or what, and we could just go on and on, so many examples. And it's an identity we take on that we would say it's a clinging. We may not be consciously aware of a clinging, but we certainly are identified in that way. And when we heal that up, that unwholesome or unhelpful and inaccurate suffering generating identity kind of lets go. We don't have to create this new identity called a healthy self. I mean, you don't have to do that. We can just let go of the clinging around the unwholesome self. And then what is it? We don't have to cling to some other identity. We all have identities, but we have to hold them more lightly, that they're all impermanent and dukkha, and not to be clung to as self also. That's an example of how psychological insights, it's not really an insight into impermanence, say, for example, but it's more into our psychological, so we could say wounding, whatever word you like to use. That's an example of where those can be very liberating in service of the liberation through non-clinging. So you can see that when we talk about insights, it can be, I'm just offering, you have to try it on for yourself, that I hope will have a very broad and inclusive view about what are the things we come to know and realize about ourselves and life and how we relate to ourselves and life, that we can learn to free our hearts and minds and let go around. Reactivity, ill will, so many places and so many ways it comes, and it may not necessarily be connected with the three classic characteristics, but it can be. I'm thinking of tomorrow doing a talk on mindfulness of the body, and that would be a whole example of, say, the wisdom and what the body can teach us, both in deepening the concentration, the guidance and teaching, you could say the insights. And that's just one example of, and there's just a whole world there just in that. So I don't want to spend too much time going on and on about all the forms of insight. I just want to give a sense of that it's a big world. So far I've said a little bit, just touched on concentration samadhi, little flavors of how it can unfold, and then a little bit just to get a sense of kind of a range of insights. And the idea, this is the main point, the idea is that through having these insights, when the realizations come, the insights come, and we really get it deeply, the idea is that places of clinging kind of let go. Well, it turns out it does work that way for many people, but it does not work that way for everyone. In fact, this is really kind of the main point I want to make in this talk, that the pathway, the way to freeing our hearts and minds doesn't look just one way. This is what I said when we first started this talk. So there are people who really, it feels like experientially that it's more insights, and there can be a lot of perceptions that they're aware that they're seeing, perceiving very directly in many, many of these ways. But other people, as the practice deepens, it may not feel like insight's happening at all. Many people find that as the mind steadies and they're more on the samadhi side, it just leads to a balanced equanimity, a non-reactivity, the steadiness of the mind. And the mind doesn't grasp onto things so much. It doesn't push away things or pull away from things so much. And it's able to rest connected in the flow of life and experience, connected with themselves, in a way that's the same kind of liberation. And yet people don't experience it. They wouldn't put the label insights on there. It came actually more of an equanimity that rose out of on the samadhi side. So there's other flavors of this, but that gives you an idea that it's not just one way the practice is supposed to look. And so this leads to the last piece I want to talk about today, which is what I started with. We need to find our own truth and our own genuine unfolding of the path. And we want to get informed by all these different teachings. And the more we're exposed to and understand the range of possibilities, that can help inform. Like, you don't have to remember all the details that I've spoken about here, but when these things, if they arise, it'll be there in your mind. You'll remember it, and you'll be able to know what this is. Oh yeah, this was what was talked about then. But it's not supposed to be one way. And so let me say a few things about the range of ways we can put these into practice. First of all, I've been focusing on the concentration and the insight. I want to just bring in two other qualities that are in both mindfulness and the heart qualities. So on the mindfulness, these days, mindfulness, it's like there's many kinds of meditation that are called mindfulness meditation. And it takes many, many forms. It's not just one way, both in Buddhist and Dharma contexts, but also in what we would call secular contexts, right? And businesses, schools, there's mindfulness. Anyway, it's everywhere these days, which is, I think, a nice thing. It's a good thing. So this word mindfulness is everywhere. So there may be kinds of meditation. We're not going to talk about that now. Some people equate insight meditation with mindfulness meditation as the same. I don't equate them, but that's fine. So I just want to name that whatever we do starts with mindfulness. We have to know what's happening. If you're connecting with your breathing, it's called mindfulness of breathing. You're being aware of and knowing your breathing. So the mindfulness comes in whether we're consciously stressing it or not. Everything has to bring the mindfulness in. And the qualities of the heart, they come in a few ways. You can, as we do here, we just, before this talk, some of you each day we're setting aside one of the meditation sessions for formal metta, loving kindness, and formal compassion practices. And so we can formally practice them. And there are people whose whole meditation is, say, metta meditation, and they're in whatever form they're doing it. So it can be a practice that we formally cultivate. that's, I think, important. You have to find your own relationship with that. Another way, which is my own personal way, is that I do some of the formal practices for sure. I think it's important. For me, I try to actually consciously bring in heart practices in whatever I'm doing. So when we speak about having kindness for ourselves as we're practicing, that's an example of cultivating the good heart. And we could say a lot more, but I'm just mentioning the mindfulness and the loving kindness and compassion, because I think that in whatever way, whether it's formal practice or we just infuse those qualities in, we have to find our own way. Again, it's not one way for everyone. Whether we think we're doing concentration or insight meditation. Going back to one of the things I said about concentration side, remember I said that an undistracted mind can evolve, it can develop in a couple of different main ways. It could become undistracted in a very narrow, exclusive way, and you just stop noticing other things. Or it can be more of and it can feel kind of disconnecting in a sense, but it can also be a profoundly connecting, where the mind is like the still forest pool, where many kinds of animals, many experiences can come and go to drink at the pool. In other words, we see many things come and go, but the mind is still. If you thought that the way to liberating your heart and mind was through insights into one of the characteristics, say impermanence, then you would need to connect profoundly with the experience of change and impermanence. You would put your attention right on that. And if you developed a kind of concentration, that first kind that became exclusive and you actually lost, you got very concentrated, but you lost connection with the experience of change, you can see how you wouldn't think that was a good kind of concentration. Because all of a sudden you've disconnected from change. You have to have insight into that in order to liberate your mind. That is the reason why you hear people say, and it's one of the confusions out there for many people, is you're either doing concentration, meditation, or insight. But if you're doing concentration practice, you're not doing insight meditation. It's because for those people, the understanding of concentration is that it leads to that disconnected, exclusive concentration where you lose connection with change. You're just engrossed in the feelings of the samadhi itself. So you can understand how people would tend to separate them out. I tend to bring them together and include, and I don't separate them. It's one of the things I'm quite explicit about in the way that I practice, is that you can take the samadhi as far as you want, all the way to these states called jhana, which I'm consciously not talking about jhana on here, but I'm just saying there's this word that many of you have heard. If you haven't heard the word jhana, I'll just mention this, that the word jhana itself actually just means to meditate, but it has a very specific meaning about some very specialized meditative states of very profound and powerful samadhi when you take the practice quite far. So that's something actually we may do some specialized jhana retreats coming up. We'll see how that goes. If you're on our email list, you would find out about that. So it is something of interest perhaps to some of us, right? So in the way that I'm offering here, and it's not better than any other way, it's just another way. We're not doing either concentration practice or insight. We're actually taking the concentration as far as we can. And as we said, but we're developing a deepening the connection. So even when you're on the concentration side, the insights can come because you're actually more profoundly attuned to your experience. And then there's the times, as we've said in the instructions in the morning, where we let go of the samadhi side and we more have to tend to whatever the experience that happens, whether we just have to learn how to be with it mindfully and let go around it, or do we need to actually maybe investigate and look into this changing or it's suffering by clinging or whatever. if you choose to do a practice that's called, and you in your mind, you're consciously decided, I'm going to do more concentration practice, then you're choosing to emphasize practices that are on the steadying of the mind. And as I just said, if it opens in a way that's connecting, then it just naturally connects. As practice unfolds, regardless of which way the concentrations naturally unfold, and it can be steered in the other direction. So even if you're going to that disconnecting kind, it's easy to steer it into a connecting kind. And if you get into that, you just talk to me, or maybe there's some other teachers, it's easy to work with. But sometimes we need someone to work with on that. It's not a big deal. But if you think you're focusing on the concentration side of practice, you do that, that's great. You just go for it. On its own, without you doing anything to make it happen, you're going to be on the insight side of the practice. There'll be all the times when you can't concentrate. You don't have to go looking. Your body's going to hurt. You're going to be mad. You can't do it. You're falling asleep. All your psychology's coming up, whatever it is. And you need to have the tools to work with it. The mindfulness and insight have to come in. So even if you think you're just doing concentration, really we're bringing all those pieces always have to come in. And if you think, well, I'm not really emphasizing the concentration. By the way, even the people who are like the pure insight side of the practice will all say you want to develop a certain amount of, I'll come back to what I was saying in just a moment. Everyone thinks you should develop a certain amount of undistractedness, right? If your mind's scattered all over the place, we always say it's fine, it's just what's happening, and it is. But yes, it serves us to train the mind to be able to steady and settle more. And so even if you think I'm just doing mindfulness and insight, you're going to develop a certain amount of steadiness. How much depends, there's a big range among teachers on how much they want to emphasize the samadhi, even if they're pure insight teachers. But if you're on the insight, so that's an example, even if you think you're doing insight practice, you start paying attention to your experience. You're having to direct your mindfulness. The mind will settle and you end up getting the concentration. So you really literally cannot have one without the other, but we can consciously, purposely emphasize either as our whole practice, or it may naturally develop in one way or the other. So there are people who are like naturally more samadhi oriented. And I actually work with a group of these people. I think it's just because of my book on samadhi, I must attract them. And there's a group of very experienced samadhi people that I work with regularly as a group. And they all report that just by the emphasis on the samadhi side, just like I was saying, all of these other awarenesses come in. The equanimity comes in, or sometimes it feels like the insights are there. And then, or you may choose to, or on its own, it unfolds feeling like more of insight is more the predominant feeling of it for you. And you'll be in a company with many, many great masters. And, if you go to places like Spirit Rock and IMS, they'll tend to teach more in that style. And you'll see for yourself the benefits and the power that come. So it's kind of, the good news is that there is no right or wrong. You can't screw it up. Anytime you just take some time to set aside the normal distractions of our day the best you can, and just to do whatever methods or techniques you use that help you settle in and connect with yourself, bring your attention into the process of your own mind and body, all of these qualities will naturally develop in their own way. So you can't help but get tremendous fruit and benefit. And I think we'll all see that, and hopefully already do for ourselves. And you can choose to steer it in different ways and play with it if you want. It's fine. Again, there's no right or wrong. If, again, I'm just to kind of bookend, if you're consciously, purposely interested in the style and the way that I'm offering here, which is to purposely have an integrated style where you're not doing concentration practice, you're not doing insight practice. It's just a one, I don't know, we have to come up with an, it's too clumsy to say mindfulness, concentration, insight, and love all integrated and synthesized as one style of practice, meditation. That's a little too clumsy. So, but if you want to do that, then you keep practicing it in this way, where you're consciously turning your mind, putting a lot of emphasis actually just with the breath to concentrate, and being quite willing to know when is it time to let it go and to go to something else. As we've been saying, you're on the insight side. When it settles out, you're back on the concentration side. And then we let our present moment experience inform what to do. We don't have to choose. We just look to see what's happening and what is most useful or skillful in service of where we're aiming. And so to end, I just want to emphasize that point. One of the things that I've been saying so far from this whole retreat, it's that idea of letting our present moment experience guide us. It's not just, I suggest, not just a good idea in our formal meditation, but it goes back to what we've been talking about in previous talks and in all the instructions. It really could be just your all you need to know in life. Really, if we could do it, all we would need to remember is there's simply what's happening in any moment and what is needed, what's most useful. Maybe you wouldn't even use the term what's needed, because sometimes it doesn't feel like anything's needed. We're just doing fine and we just live with an open heart and a quiet mind. And other times, maybe we're in some struggle or difficulty, or our hearts are closed off or whatever. During those times, then maybe that's the way to think about, well, what will serve me? What's needed now? And then we need to have, the way I think of it is we're putting a lot of tools in our toolkit. And I like that image of having tools in the toolkit. And the way I think of it, I often use an example, if say there's something broken where you live and you need a carpenter. So the carpenter comes over and they look and they see, oh, there's a piece of wood that's cracked, say, and they need to put in a screw and some wood glue. Through experience, they just look and know. They're never going to pull out a saw. You don't have to think. It's just like, oh, it's a crack. But maybe when you're a new carpenter, you have to think or ask for some help. And you go, I don't know. How do you fix a crack? What are the different ways? And maybe there's 10 ways to do it. You don't know. So through experience, we come to learn. And I like to think of it, we end up with quite a collection of tools. Not only do we have a collection of tools, but we have a lot of experience with them and familiarity of how to use them and when to use them. And this is the practice that we're doing. So it's perfectly fine if we become confused or lost or we don't see the way. We make the best choices that we can, and it's good enough. It's exactly the image I used the other day if you're trying to learn to play a musical instrument. I used an example. I said my son is a pretty good, actually quite an amazing jazz trombone player. He's a middle schooler. When he started out, some of you heard this, but you may not have the other day, when I said it, he didn't know when he first started how to make a tone or how to blow up on a brass instrument and everything, but just by, he got a teacher and just by the doing. So now, in just recent weeks, I thought, I want to see if I can learn. I'm not going to become a great trombone player, but just to play a simple song on the trombone. So I have no skill. So my son's got I'm using his original beginner mouthpiece. He's got a more advanced mouthpiece now. And so I've been playing. It wears my lips out in about a minute. And he's been trying to teach me to make a buzz and make a tone. And I spend like a minute, like every couple of days, just to see if I can go. And I could not do it. He's telling me what to do. I have no skill, no ability. And he's telling me what to do, and he knows, and I can't do it. He's sitting there going, no, I hear what you're doing, Dad. No, don't do it like this. I think it was just this morning. or yesterday, I pulled it out and I said I was going to try again. And after having done this for a few weeks, not even every day, I really noticed I'm still horrible, but I noticed a definite, actually quite striking improvement. I actually could make some tones now, and I was able to, make some slide positions and get a few notes. And my son was telling me what the notes were, and it really shifted. I can feel it. And how did that happen? I don't know. It was just in the doing of it, and getting some guidance too, but it's in the just bumping up against it. Well, that's not working. Let me try this. And you just keep doing it, and it grew. And I thought that was a wonderful, it's not metaphor or analogy, but that's how our practice works too. It's complicated because, it'd be one thing if I'm sitting here saying, okay, everybody, you got to do this. It was one thing. It was simple. You don't have to think. Which could be okay, except it doesn't matter what I would say for at least half the people here, it wouldn't work. So I'm saying, no, it's actually the opposite. It's like, we don't want to put any restrictions on what's going to liberate your heart and mind. Is it liberating your heart and mind? That's the guidepost, staying in touch with our intention. And then, of course, we're giving a lot of tips about, yes, it's not quite that bad. It's doing practices to steady our mind and brighten mindfulness. In the doing, applying the best you can. And I want to tell you, even if it's a time in your meditation practice when you really could have used a screwdriver and you pulled out the saw of your meditation techniques, it's all right, because what's going to happen is you're going to end up sawing off the piece of wood that you needed to have there. Guess what? You'll never do that again. Yeah, you got to fix it and you'll go get it. That's not that great of an analogy, but it's like, because that's how we learn. That's how the carpenter learned. You think that carpenter did a good, clean cut the first time? No, it took many cuts. And so this is what I mean. We don't have to worry or be afraid. We just have to step forward and using our best judgment. And so to end, I want to give you a quote that's in the spirit of this that I really love. And this is a quote that I think for me brings in the spirit of really self-acceptance and kindness and letting ourselves be just where we are. This is a quote from an author, E.L. Doctorow. And the quote is about writing a novel, but I'm going to change writing a novel to the word Dharma practice. Actually, you could say living life. He said, writing a novel, I'm going to say your meditation or your Dharma practice is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can complete the journey of 1,000 miles that way. And isn't that really true? It really is. You don't have to have more awareness. You don't have to have a steadier mind than you have. You don't have to have a clearer mind. You don't have to have better mindfulness. You don't have to have more insight. You don't have to have a more loving heart. It's just a wonderful thing. I don't have to know anything about playing the trombone, and I can see it's actually moving. It's just by taking the step using the best awareness that we have, and we move one step forward, now we see a little further. So maybe we have a little more clarity, we make the best judgment, and we cannot help but move in a direction that keeps us deepening in alignment with our beautiful intentions and aspirations.